Hello again, everyone. I'm very pleased to announce our next guests, our next panel. Many of you will know who these folks are. First, let me say about Google, who is intimately involved in this panel. Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Google is now widely recognized as the world's largest search engine, an easy-to-use free service that returns relevant results in a fraction of a second. We're very pleased today to have two folks here. First, Eric Schmidt, who is the CEO of Google Incorporated, and Rachel Maddow, who has a radio show on Air America. We'll be launching her own show on NBC starting a week from Monday. Please welcome Eric Schmidt and Rachel Maddow.
Thank you.
Thanks, Duke. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks all for coming. Until my last name is a verb, I will assume that it is not me who you came to see today, but rather our esteemed guest from Google, Eric Schmidt.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think you are on your way to becoming a verb.
But
Right.
only if the subject of the sentence in which I am a verb is Patrick J. Buchanan. Other than that,
That's
I'm not
great.
sure I've ever Maddowed anybody. We'll check, though. We'll have to check the archives. I'm sure Google has the archives. So it seems to me that for the last 12 years or so, there have been hyperventilating headlines come political season that this is the first internet election. This is the election where all the most important stuff happens online. This is the election, and I think this has happened for the past 12 years, where the internet will change the way the next blank is elected, the next president is elected. I don't think that has been true in previous elections, and I don't know whether or not it's true with this one. Do you think this one is materially different?
Well, since I was the one who made those claims for the last 12 years, my credibility is pretty low.
Admittedly self-serving, I understand.
So take that with a grain of thought. But I think, in fact, you can see the progression. If you look at I've said for a long time that there was going to be an election where the outcome on the margin was determined by the internet, and that actually did occur in 2006. If you go back to, it's actually worth studying it. George Allen, of course, was in a tight race in the Senate in Virginia, and he said the M word, which was caught on YouTube. And in a tight race, that switched the seat. That switching of seats switched control of the Senate, which changed the outcome of the Bush presidency. That's the first step. The second step is what we've seen now, where if you think about the self-reinforcing nature of traditional media, 2.5 years ago, it was impossible for anyone to be a legitimate and powerful challenger to the incumbent in the media, which was Mrs. Clinton. And the only way you could do that is by coming in sideways. And the internet allowed Senator Obama, with a very small team, to raise enough money. So you had the messenger, you had the message, and you had a medium at the time. And it was that created the opportunity for him to become a challenger in the traditional media.
How, in this election, I know that Google has a big election sort of initiative doing a lot of things regarding the political system right now, not in a partisan way, but just as a process way. I see how the internet functions as a bulletin board, as a place where you post stuff and other people can easily see it. I also see how it functions as a fundraising tool, fundraising conduit, I guess. An easy place to have people submit their credit card numbers. What else can the internet be, and do you think Google is part of making that happen in this election cycle right now?
Well, we spend all day trying to figure out how you should live your whole life on the internet, right? So, it is what we do. And one of the characteristics of the internet is it changes the power structure between individuals and established institutions. So you see that over and over again. In Google's case, we have a lot of things that we're doing as part of the convention. Obviously, this activity, it was obvious that there was an important community that did not really have a seat at the table, basically this group, and we wanted you to be part of that on whatever terms made sense for you guys. And it's worked out incredibly well. We're very happy with that. We're doing a lot of other things. For example, there's historically this notion of, there's 12 different layers of security and badges. Why don't we just let the people in using digital technology? So we have things like we have 3D models of the various stadiums and so forth. We have cameras and so forth, which are showing what's really going on to the degree that we can get it. We've got interview yourself and put yourself on YouTube. And remember, one of the fundamental characteristics of people is everybody wants to be on television, right? So we give everybody an opportunity to be on television, and they can show it to their mom, which is fundamentally what life is all about. But it matters, right? And it matters big time. Maybe an even more serious thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to get it to the point where people who want to vote can figure out where they're registered and where they should vote, right? Like, what a concept. And it turns out that the information about polling precincts, zip codes, registrations are in databases that are sort of from the mainframe era. And so getting all those things into a system so that you could literally say, I've decided to vote. Amazing. Where do I vote? Those kinds of data collections, putting those on Google Maps, Google Earth is very important. Is Brittany here? Did I see her? Yeah, can you just show one slide? This is Brittany Bonet. I think you want to.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Bonet, and I'm here to talk briefly about what we're doing to put registration information and polling location information on Google. If we could get the slide up. We have an example. This is still sort of in beta. What we're trying to do is...
I love showing slides in a translucent tent.
Right.
Translucent, yes.
So imagine what the slide says.
Sorry.
It works really well at night, guys.
Essentially, we are trying to stay consistent with Google's mission of making the world's information universally accessible and useful, and part of this information is polling location and registration information. So we're attempting to work with local election officials to organize this data and put it online on Google Maps so that a user will simply input their address and be able to find their registration site, their polling location. And this is an effort that will be ongoing towards November, and we are, oh, there we go. Hey. There's an example of it. And we are steadfastly working to collect this data. We want to make it findable for users, because right now, as most people know, it's a maze for people to wade through these local election sites. And we believe that we can attempt to be the central source for that information.
I would just have one question, and sort of, I guess, that has an embedded comment in it on that. And the idea of making it easier for Americans to vote, not only to know where to vote, but to know how to vote, to get through the maze of, as Brittany, as you described, the sort of, I guess, matrix of confusing, out-of-date electoral systems that we've got in this country. To make it easier for people to vote has become a partisan thing in this country. The idea of it being more difficult to vote has been a political goal of the Republican Party, and to make it easier to vote has been a goal of the Democratic Party. They may think that you're siding with the Democrats on this.
Well, the principle of voting is one that was established a long time before you and I were born.
And a long time before political parties.
And there's a long history of trying to exclude people from voting, especially minorities and so forth, which I think is reprehensible. So this is a simple thing that all of us who care about democracy can do, is get more people to vote. I think it's well established that voting participation is declining in our country, and it's particularly declining among young people. Since Google is full of young people, I sort of asked them, why are you not voting? And their position is, it doesn't matter. Right? So to the degree that we can make civic duty and participation fundamental, I think it's better for the country. The United States is a remarkable democracy, and I'm very proud to be a citizen, as I know you are. And the principles that were established under the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and so forth are not negotiable, right, including the right to vote.
On the uncomfortable issue of taking sides, one of the things that I'm sure you get asked about a lot is to have simultaneously going on in Google land and in politics these two things. In Google land, we have more and more living our lives online. We have, Google Gmail, GChat, Google Documents, Google Maps, Google Finance, all of which I have used to a certain extent at some time, and therefore a lot more about me being known to a certain, in some way by Google. We've got that going on in technology and in your business. And on the other side, we've got a very, very aggressive and oftentimes very secret effort by our own government to spy on us, to get more information about us. And I think the fear that's come out of these two things happening at once is that even if Google is not trying to be evil, the concentration of information about us through all these different tools that Google provides may make it a lot easier for the government to be very much more evil than they could have been if Google didn't exist. Is there a responsibility, a corporate responsibility in terms of holding on to the trust of your customers, but also sort of responsibility as an American corporation trying to do this, to be an active force in resisting government efforts to get more information about its citizens secretly?
There's a problem with the government, which is they have guns and we don't. And so the term resistance, you want to sort of be careful. The reality, and I have to say this bluntly because people get confused, we are required to follow U.S. law, and we do so even if we don't like it. And as a CEO of a public company or even a private company, there can be no other answer. The good news about America is that we have judges and we have a court system. And if you get, for example, an overbroad subpoena, as we did over essentially invading people's sort of these broad searches for information that's not relevant, you can convince a federal judge to restrict that. The reason I say it so precisely is that such good things in America are not necessarily true in other countries. So you want to look at this on a country-specific basis. From a Google perspective, we operate on the first principle that our users' privacy, and we operate about essentially our end users' brand and what they care about. And we do worry that as this information gets collected, it becomes a treasure trove. And you can imagine, in the worst possible case, the scenario you described, which is sort of the spook scenario, where we know everything you're doing, and so the government decides to track you. Now, this is not a new phenomena. If you look at the history of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, this occurred in the 40s and 50s with what were then now, which were at the time illegal and are certainly illegal now, activities, which were found to be wrong. So there is a history of this, but it's important that we be aware of it. And one of the reasons to be optimistic is that in the 40s and 50s, you couldn't talk about this stuff. And now, because of the nature of the internet, the nature of free speech, the blogging community, and so forth, if these scenarios were to occur, people would know instantaneously. So part of the way that I answer the question of how do you know you should trust Google is the moment we did something untrustworthy to any one of you, every other one of you would know within about 5 nanoseconds. And it would become the conversation in the room, and you all would very quickly move to a competitor choice.
Privacy is a hard thing to get people exercised about, particularly when the trade-off is convenience and free software that makes life easier. You think, yeah, maybe Google has the biggest database in the world and I'm in it, and I'm a little uncomfortable about Google in China, and I'm a little worried about my own government's reach and this NSA spying thing and FISA, and I'm worried about all this stuff, but boy, do I love Google Documents. And boy, do I love GChat. And boy, do I love all of these things that are available to us. We're willing to make that trade-off, but ultimately, there will be other people who are offering, ultimately, your competitors will be offering stuff that meets our convenience needs, but they will compete with you on the grounds of privacy. They will say, you know, Google holds your information for 18 months, we hold it for 18 days.
Which competitor was that? Because our privacy policy is the best one.
Well, how long do you hold information about your users?
18 months.
Don't you think somebody will come along and compete on those grounds?
I would welcome it. and one of the problems is that one man's privacy argument is another man's terrorist argument. So there is the problem in any democracy is there's an issue of the legitimate use of the state to investigate crimes, for example, versus the rights of privacy. And Google is not in a position to make that decision. That is a societal decision. And I can tell you that that decision is as much a cultural decision as it is a legal decision. I'll give you an example. In the United Kingdom, they have more CCD cameras in public and street corners than the sum of all the other CCD cameras in the rest of the world. So when you walk down any street, essentially in London, you're on camera. They also have some of the most end-user favored libel laws, so that if anything bad is said about you, you can sue, and often you can get it retracted, which is not true. Those are cultural decisions, right? here's a perfectly legitimate democracy, which we learned a lot from, which made choices different than the U.S. So my point is that you have to look at this in a cultural context, and we, Google, have to follow their law, right, in both cases.
What are Google's values?
Well, Google is fundamentally focused on what end users care about, and that's why we have the most aggressive privacy policy in the sense of keeping information the least amount of time. And we're talking about making these things even more restrictive. So I don't know if you know the details here, but we do things like anonymize cookies, we forget the logs after a certain amount of time, that kind of thing.
I have one more needling question to ask on this subject, and then I promise we'll pivot. And that is, given Google's values and the, as you say, reflecting the desires of your customers, of the people who use the products, what's going to happen with Google in China? Will Google always have censored search results in order to make the Chinese government allow you into the country?
It's worth understanding this in context. There's something called the Great Firewall at China. I don't know if you all have you've been to the regular wall. Well, there's also the Great Firewall. And China has organized its internet with a set of servers that they can arbitrarily turn off and on connections. So any non-Chinese firm has to go through this firewall. And the laws are so precise that it is illegal for me to describe to you the details of the law. And the good news is I don't know it anyway, but
It's a good safeguard.
the safeguard is I can't commit a crime. But for example, the secrecy laws with respect to some of this are really quite draconian and would make any of us upset if you dug into them. But nevertheless, those are the laws of China. So we faced a choice. 1.3 billion people on the other side of this wall. There are about 220 million internet users. It's one of the fastest growing communities of internet users. And the question was, would they be better off if they had Google under the law, or would they be better off without it? And we made the decision to essentially to engage rather than stay estranged. But we made some other changes which I think are illustrative of how we think. The number of censored results, a rough summary is that as long as you don't say the word Falun Gong, you're fine. I'm not trying to joke about it, it's very serious, but the fact of the matter is if you say something like Falun Gong, that's an example of something which is not allowed. And so what we do is when you do a query like that, we publish a link which says the information was removed in Chinese. So I don't know about you all, but my experience with Chinese people is they're very smart. So what do you think they do when they see that? Okay, do you think that they say, oh, well, the government doesn't want me to see this. Oh, okay, well, I won't look at it. What do you think?
I don't think they do that.
I suspect, without, in my case, endorsing any illegal activity, that the very smart Chinese people that I know spend a fair amount of time then trying to actually use some, shall we say, mechanisms that allow them to get to that information. This strategy has been so successful, and this is what I wanted the punchline here, that in fact the local competitors in information now do the same thing. So we're pretty proud of that.
Talking about living online, living your life online, you can also run countries online. And some, I'm thinking specifically of Estonia, but I know that there are other, not only national governments, but state and local governments that are essentially trying to move almost all of their functions into an online framework. Do you worry about cyber war?
Well, of course, we had the example of cyber war in a real war, which had to do with Russia and Georgia. And there were what are called denial of service attacks against a set of Georgian websites. There's a lot of argument among the technical community as to whether that was instigated by the Russians or by people sympathetic to Russians or people having a good time and used at inopportune moments to have, but there's evidence that this had an effect on the outcome and certainly on the public discourse. So the answer is it's a very real threat. The internet community as a whole worries about this a lot. There are many, many working groups that look at it. The internet is organized in such a way that almost everything is so redundant, it would be very difficult, for at least for the larger countries and larger sites, to really be materially affected by this. There's historically been a vulnerability in something called the domain root servers, which are the top-level domains. And so, for example, a few months ago, there was a defect found in one of the name servers, right? So that's an example. But these are pretty abstruse examples. So I think that the odds of, in a major confrontation, cyber war becoming determinant is probably pretty low. But I think the Georgia example will tell people who are, in fact, trying to put material things on the government online to make sure that they really understand redundancy, security, and so forth. The tools are pretty good now if you have the right sort of rocket scientists to get it right.
See, it always seems to me that the great parallel is to think about Eisenhower having sold the American people the idea of the interstate system as being necessary for national security. If we ever needed to move a lot of people and material within the continental United States, we'd need good roads. Therefore, we get this spectacular inheritance of infrastructure that is the interstate system. And understanding not only what is online, but the ability to move through the online world for people to be able to share, access information that way, and to control the world around them that way is part of our infrastructure, and it needs to be resilient.
But that's no different from, I mean, you all, most of you look like you're too young to know the history of the ARPANET, but DARPA was funded, the Division of Advanced Research Projects Agency, to provide military technology solutions during the Vietnam War. And the people that I worked with when I was a young programmer worked for DARPA, and in fact the bids and the proposals were written by computer scientists who took their computer science proposals and put various war metaphors around them, submitted them, got them funded, and funded me, okay, 30 years ago. So the fact of the matter is that there is a long history in America, because we spend so much money on the military-industrial complex, that there's a large set of examples of that kind of money being used, and I think to very good effect. And I think one of the reasons that packet switching and the internet is in fact so resilient is in fact because when the original designs were done, they were done to handle link failure, that is the ability to blow up, you know, a tank over here or a tank over there, or at least that was the argument that was made at the time.
Is Google a defense contractor?
In the legal sense, as far as I know, no, although it's a big company.
I've heard, yes.
We do sell search devices to the government and governments around the world, and we have occasionally, I'm sure, sold them to, you know, three-letter agencies.
In what sense is Google American, other than the fact that you are incorporated here? In what sense is Google an American company?
Well, it's an interesting question, because if you were outside of the U.S., the questions I would get have to do with American hegemony. Because there's a view of the internet that the internet was invented by Americans as being forced on everybody else. And the social values, so for example, the values that we have about free speech and the things that we all take so seriously here in the room, are not necessarily the same values that everybody else has. And there's a pretty big resistance to that. So I would argue that not only is Google American, but the values that you and I are discussing would be seen by a non-American as so obviously biased in favor of American values that it's actually embarrassing. And to give you the numbers, the internet is growing very, very quickly still. They're on the order of 1.5 billion users, so we're only about a quarter of the way through. China is now larger than the United States in the number of users, and that's not going to get fixed anytime soon, right? China's a large country. Eventually, most people believe that India will have the largest concentration of end users in the world. Today, English is slightly ahead of Chinese in its usage on the internet. So it's very important that if you take an internet view, the U.S. is a small component of internet activity. And what part of our goal is to continue that, obviously, because of the spread of mobile phones. And so it's probable that in our lifetimes, as that number goes, you know, we had another few billion users, they're going to be using mobile phones on 3G networks that are in countries that none of us have visited.
I have one last question for you, and then we're going to go to you guys. Forgive me, this question requires me to do an impression, and I'm very bad at impressions. But I wanted to ask what your first thought was when you heard the internet. It's not just a big truck you dump something on. It's a series of tubes. What did you think when you heard Alaska Senator Ted, forgive my impression, Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, who's got such an important role in our legislative branch, with overseeing sectors in which you operate. What was your thought about his characterization of the series
Well,
of
you know,
tubes?
there's always a person who's first, and there's another person who's last. And we found him. That was literally my thought.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we are ready to take some questions. I do believe that this guy here in the cute visor has a microphone, so you'll have to flirt with him enough to get him to come to you to get your question asked. David Korn.
I'm told I have to stand up.
Very good.
I'm David Korn, the Washington editor of Mother Jones Magazine, and I also, thank you, and I also blog for CQPolitics.com. Two quick questions. The first question is, you just went into Ted Stevens. What about John McCain and the internet? But the more serious question is, I've heard you before talk about your concern that what Google is doing to journalism by, with Google News in particular, collecting what the work that I and others in this room sometimes do and putting it up there and not really generating a revenue stream for us, and within an environment where there are a lot of economic pressures, and particularly you pointed out your concern about what happens with investigative journalism under this model, because of all journalism, that's the most expensive to produce. So how can Google, which is great in bringing the work that I and others do to a wider audience, actually make sure that the economic rug is not pulled out from those of us who do have to do this?
On the journalism question, I think it's self-evident now that we've got a major national crisis around journalism, and in particular investigative journalism. Virtually all of the interesting stuff that's affected our country has been exposed by one or the other by investigative journalism. And you just worry as a citizen that it's sort of going away under the economic pressures. And the economic pressures are very real. Let's go through them. Newsprint is higher, so that's a real cost. It's really a problem. Another real problem has been the lack of effectiveness or loss of ad revenue of traditional advertising on newspapers. And the third thing has been the shift of classifieds from traditional classifieds to online, of which Google is one of the companies to do that. And I think the bluntest answer is that we don't know yet how to answer your question. It's a very, very good question. And we're working hard to try things. This is an opportunity for experimentation. Google News, as you pointed out, has been very, very successful. And it drives a lot of traffic to sites. So we're working on advertising technologies that when that traffic comes to those sites will produce better revenue. But the math still doesn't work. In other words, the online sites don't generate as much either gross or net revenue as the newspapers that they're being replaced by. And there's evidence that this is going to get worse, unfortunately. And the easiest way to do this is ask somebody who's in their 20s how they get their news. And their answer inevitably is online. So it is generational. So I think there's a race, and the race is to develop online news products which have an advertising component or a subscription component that works. And in order for that to work, they have to be relevant, targeted, personalized, and we're working on those ideas. The other comment I was going to make about online news, which I'm also worried about, has to do with the fact that online news is typically so targeted that you miss the other function of the newspaper, which is to learn things you didn't know you were supposed to know. And that, again, there are technological solutions that you can imagine. There are human editor solutions. But, for example, in your blog, you don't write the blog just to the things that I care about. You write about things that you care about, and I learn by reading your blog. How do we make sure that that occurs systematically and on a global scale?
Hi, I'm Cheryl Conti. I blog as Jill Tubman at Jack and Jill Politics, which is one of the top black blogs on the internet today. Thank you. I'm also a social media consultant and have my own firm. What do you have to say to those who have raised concerns about the hiring practices at Google in regards to diversity? They say that 2 heads are better than 1. You know, how many heads are black, Latino, Asian, et cetera?
We've actually looked at this pretty carefully, and we are pretty happy with the way our recruiting works. We do team recruiting, and we're very thorough about people's backgrounds, and so forth. We have a pretty aggressive outreach program, and we measure bias to the degree we can. An interesting example was that we studied male versus female engineering recruiting. And it turns out that statistically, the grading that we did about the male male engineering candidates was predictive, and the grading that we did during the interview process for the women that we hired was anti-correlated. In other words, it was completely wrong. So we had actual data that showed what was a bizarre sort of a bias that existed in our system, and we changed our system to correct that. So we're good enough now analytically to look at hiring practices and outcomes to actually then correlate back to see, was there some form of systematic bias, and when we can find it, we correct it. And I think that's going to be the hiring standards going forward for most companies, because it's such an important issue. They're really going to check whether did they somehow have a bias that prevented them from getting a superstar. We've done it with women. It's harder for African Americans and Latinos because we had such a small set coming in. And so the blunt answer there is that you have to take affirmative action. You literally have to go special sourcing for those categories. It's very, very important that our workforce reflect the diversity of the world. Diversity is the answer at every level. You get better products, you get a better culture, the branding is better. There's all sorts of reasons why diversity is the right answer.
And are you doing affirmative action
Yeah.
toward African Americans?
And similarly with sexual preference.
Hi, my name is Dave Friedman. I'm a graduate from Tulane University. My question is about signal-to-noise ratio on the internet. With the rise of user-generated content, there's a lot that's good, but there's also just a ton that's bad. Google's mission is to organize information. Is it possible to remove some of the clutter, or can you only cut through it?
Well, first of all, we try to not remove any clutter, because one man's clutter is another man's
Unabomber
priceless,
manifesto.
Yeah,
Yeah.
priceless.
Sorry.
That's right. An interesting statistic is that there's 13 hours of YouTube video uploaded every minute, and that number is increasing. So of course no human could possibly watch all of this stuff. And every time that we do a ranking, we try to declutter. And so if our answers look to you like clutter, then we've failed in providing the right ranking that's relevant to you. And so that's a bug. But we've taken the position that computers and our algorithms and good judgment, to the degree we can do it, will allow the signal-to-noise ratio, which you, I think, accurately described, that we can take, literally the needle in the haystack and find that one thing out of all that clutter that is really what you're interested in. And we take that as our mission. And by the way, the alternatives in a world where you have such enormous access to publishing are all bad. We don't want to prevent people from publishing. We think it's wonderful that you have user-generated content, and not everyone is a Thoreau, but everyone thinks they are, right? So the fact of the matter is we try to help people sort out who the real Thoreau is.
Hi, I'm Amr Tureen. I'm the CEO founder of allvoices.com. It's a news internet website. And my question is, and some related to news, is I've heard that Google News is not very profitable, and it has the least resources given to Google News as any other part of Google. Is that true?
I'm sure that one of the Google News people told you this. And by the way, the Google News people, they're not the least profitable, they're no profitable. So that would be like the bottom. So they didn't make any money at all. So we've debated and debated whether we should try to ourselves make money from Google News. And every time you look at the resources that we have, every time we decide it's more important to add more features and more international support for countries which don't have a vibrant online community like we do, we're fortunate of in the United States. So we've taken a position to not focus on monetization. That's the right decision. At some point, we will focus on it. And with respect to resources, they have sufficient resources, trust me, and we do prioritize it, and we're happy with the level of resources that they have. That's right.
Good morning. Thank you very much for taking the time to meet with all of us. My name is Arthur Young. My connections are UC Berkeley, where I teach, the U.S. Green Building Council, the U.S. Green Real Estate Council. And why I'm wanting to ask you a question is that because Google has a very significant corporate social responsibility policy. And I almost have my answer for you, and you'd throw it back to me, but I'm hoping there might be a slight opening. 1/3 of our election machines in this country are unverifiable. We have absolutely no reason to believe that this election can't be hacked, and guys like bradblog.com and velvetrevolution.us are enormously convinced of it. I'm wondering if Google might consider taking a position in using Google Maps and making it incredibly simple for anyone either to register with information, to be able to know that their polls are secure in terms of certain protocols. It's a very complicated subject. I don't want to make this question long, but I'm wondering if there can be some union between Google Maps and free, clear, and countable elections.
That's interesting. So there have been a lot of analyses of this voting machine question, and every analysis has indicated that a small number of changes to the way voting machines work would make the thesis of your entire question not correct. And those reports have been delivered to Congress and the President over the last 8 years, ever since Florida. So I can only conclude that our government chose to not act on these reports, which are not in dispute, because they either are incompetent, paid off, or don't believe in science. You pick. But everybody that I know in the computing world believes that a small change in these electronic voting machines with essentially paper records would fix this problem. So the first message is that we have people here from all around the country, if you find yourself in a situation where you cannot establish that there is a proper record being, and when I vote, I ask them, show me that you're, not screwing me, basically, in a nice way. And so first place, I think citizen activism is here, which the government may actually respond to. We have to be very, very careful about where we draw the line with respect to voting and the politicization of it. And if there were a feed or a way in which that we could get that information that was reliable and seen as reasonably unbiased, I'm sure we would look at it. I don't think Google is in the business of investigating polling places and so forth. We'll have to let others do that. Go ahead.
Common Cause has a 480-page book. All the information's been accessed.
So
and thank you very much for your consideration.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fareed Ben-Amour. I work in political organizing, and I wanted to bring us back to something Rachel said earlier. She made a great analogy to the Eisenhower, federal freeway system, and with the internet becoming such not only a crucial mode of communication, but really a way of building communities. What do you think our future administration should be doing to ensure that these communities will thrive online and finally bridge the digital divide? And what is Google doing on this end?
Well, the good news about computing technology and the internet is that it's a declining cost business. Most people forget what life was like without cell phones, right? So do an experiment. Throw all your digital devices away for a day and see how long you last. If you can do that, do it for a week. You'll find that these technologies are really quite fundamental now, and they're getting cheaper. So the good news is we've got physics and science working on our side. They really are getting cheaper. The U.S. is one of the slowest broadband policies of any of the westernized countries. The number one, by the way, fastest broadband is Japan. The number two, by the way, is France. The U.S. is, under various studies, 15, 16, 17, and almost all of that is essentially sort of government policy related. So that's a first step. We know that people who have broadband connections are much, much more likely to do the kind of innovation and new services. So that's step one. Step two, which we actually were able to achieve with the FCC, is try to open up some of the mobile networks so that you could get an arbitrary device connected to it. And I'm very pleased to say that the FCC commissioner and the FCC supported a number of people, including Google's view, that it should be possible to connect to these wireless data networks in a pretty open way. So that's a great win. There are other things in industrial policy, various forms of R&D tax credit and those kinds of things. There's a lot of discussion about privacy and copyrights and so forth. But the fundamental thing is probably just access to broadband networks, whether they're mobile or in the house. And we are not ahead in America. Having invented all this stuff, we're not number one.
I think we've got time. We've got 5 minutes. We've got time for 2 or 3 more questions, depending. Two more. Okay.
Hi, my name's Julie Lynn Gibbons. I'm a blogger with MichiganLiberal.com, and more importantly, I work for a nonprofit, which is Progress Michigan, part of the Progress Now network. And it's meant a lot for me as a blogger to bring Google tools, Google Apps, to a nonprofit setting, and you make that possible through the C3 grant. And I was just wondering, a lot has been talked about what you're doing with the philanthropy. Heard about a lot of press that your folks have gotten. And where are you looking to take your philanthropy, particularly for nonprofits and struggling organizations that are really looking to make a difference?
Well, Google has a group called Google.org, which has a set of initiatives. The one that's getting a lot of press right now has to do with renewable energy and electricity versus coal. And the simple equation is RE less than C. If you can get the coal price up and the cost of renewable electricity down, people will switch over. And that has huge benefits to the society as a whole. It's obviously greater security, gas prices go down because there's less demand, so forth and so on. There are other things about open government and so forth. We've had a lot of success, by the way, with these AdWords grants and nonprofits. We send a lot of traffic to those sites, which bring them new users, new donors, and so forth. And so that's probably the one that has the biggest impact on people here in the room, and we're very, very proud of that.
We've got time for one more question. See, this is why you wore the visor, because you were going to have to do something sporty with this running thing.
All right. My name's Dave Dan. I write under name D-Day at Hullabaloo. And my question is about what's euphemistically known as search engine optimization, more familiarly known as Google bombing. And maybe in a larger sense, people use the tools that you create in ways that you didn't really expect them to be used. And, is there a way, what is your philosophy on that as a company? Do you allow that to happen? Do you think that there's, ways that might happen in a malicious fashion or a fashion where you don't want, it's going a place you don't want it to go? What are your thoughts on that?
Because of the way Google works, a simple explanation of how Google works is that we use a metric of popularity having to do with the way links work on the net. So if documents are linked to each other enough, that causes the ranking to be higher. So various people over the years have built large computer farms and simulated popularity. Again, I'm using non-technical description, but roughly that's what they're doing. And a couple of them have been successful. The most famous one is French military victories. And we decided when these things occur, first, to the degree we can detect them, we don't allow them. And we have computer scientists whose jobs are, and who are very, very clever, who could detect these sort of, because they have essentially signals that we can pick up that they're not normal, which obviously I'm not going to describe. And so we follow that. But if they exist, we take an unusual view, is that we don't take them down manually. And the reason is we would prefer people to talk about them and they become jokes, rather than there be a sense that we are removing something manually. So the simple answer is that we do everything we can with computers to prevent this search engine optimization, which we view as against the principles of Google. And if one of them is successful, then we joke about it and use ridicule to make it less effective.
We've apparently been granted a bonus question by the powers that be. Congratulations.
Thank you. My name is Samford Dickert, and I'm a member of the New York tech community. And I also get involved in politics every so often. My question to you is this. The issues that political campaigns have, such as small people trying to get into the political process, getting started with services that are engaging. Google is about accessing pre-existing information and resources. How are we going to extend the service offerings, like you do with Google Apps, to those campaigns and also to us? As in, how will we activate using Google or the Google services for engaging both political campaigns and government?
The one thing that we don't do is write great content. That's you all's job. What we can do is we can produce better tools. And the tools are pretty obvious, right? You need the authoring solutions, you need the ways of building links, and then you need the way to build community. And so the more that we can do the latter, build the community and build sort of the buzz around your content, the better we can serve you. And frankly, as we discussed earlier, Google is completely beholden to high quality content. People go to Google, they don't go to Google to watch, to look at repetitious and stupid information. They actually go to Google to find out things that they actually need to know that are of high quality as they define it. And so our relationship is such that we have to do everything we can to make sure that whatever creative thing that you can do really can get out there, whether it's video publishing, authoring, and building community. Ultimately, I think in the blogging world, these things all follow a power law, and it's all about building a buzz, building a community. And the internet allows you to explore that in many different ways. We want to make sure you can do that.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. This has been great.
Okay, thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much.
You may be able to access some of this content via CNBC or Air America, so, Google it. Thanks.
You're funny.
I don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Schmidt does not have time for questions on the stage, unless he chooses to, of course. This young lady back